like to introduce the panel members and the moderator, and if they join me up here on stage as they're introduced. The moderator will be Kathy Wurzer. She's a journalist, an author, the host of Minnesota Public Radio's Morning Edition, and the co-host of Almanac on Twin Cities Public Television. Welcome, Kathy. Our first panel member is Annette Atkins, a professor of history at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict, and author of several books, including Creating Minnesota, A History from the Inside Out. Welcome. Next panel member is Sid Bean, a documentary filmmaker and board chairman of the American Indian Community Development Corporation and the Little Earth United Tribes Housing Corporation. He's an enrolled member of the Flandreau Santee Sioux Tribe of South Dakota. His family was exiled from Minnesota after the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Welcome, Sid. Next, we have Kurt Brown, an author and reporter at the Star Tribune, who wrote a comprehensive 6-part series this year on Little Crow and the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Welcome, Kurt. And our last panel member is Dean Erdahl, a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives, who has written 4 historic novels set during the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Welcome, Representative. With that, I turn it over to you, Kat.
Thank you all for being here. It's nice to see you. Not too far away from this auditorium at the Minnesota History Center, where we're gathered today, is an exhibit that chronicles one of the pivotal points in Minnesota history. A series of events 150 years ago that helped shape Minnesota as we know it today, the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. It was a horrible time in our history, and commemorating it was a tricky undertaking for organizations like the Minnesota Historical Society. So we're going to be delving into that with several people on our panel. We'll open up the discussion for you to join us. We'll have 2 people with microphones that will go through the audience. When we get to that point, please raise your hands and we'll get to you, and we'll have a nice conversation. Thanks to you all for being here. It's nice to see you. There were, as you all know, here on the panel, many questions going into this year. What to do, how to properly commemorate such a horrible chapter in Minnesota history. The discussions took place not only here at the Minnesota Historical Society, but at smaller county historical societies and among Native people. Professor Atkins, you begin here. What were your expectations leading up to the start of this 150th anniversary?
Thanks. I had several, actually. One was, I knew that the Historical Society here would be doing an exhibit. And the main thing I knew about that and expected is that they would put together a thoughtful, complex story of difficult and complicated issues. One of the biggest dangers I think that historians run is oversimplifying the past. And one of the things I think the Historical Society has made a real effort to do is to make those people as complex as we are ourselves, to make it not a dead place of history, but to make it a living place of history. So I expected that. One thing I didn't expect, I would say, is actually to have so much public interest in this topic. Many people through the year have said, you know, I never knew anything about this before. And I was afraid that that might keep people from being engaged in the ways that they should. And another thing I didn't expect, and I know you asked what did we expect, but what I didn't expect and what I'm planning will not be the outcome is that we will solve anything. The past is a messy place. It's a contested territory, and it doesn't matter, I think, how carefully we present the issues. We are not going to fix it. We're not going to change it. We're not going to smooth it out and bring it to a point that everyone will agree about what was what. So those are my expectations. And as an historian, it's been really a thrilling time to raise these really complicated, important issues.
Sid Bean, what were your expectations leading up to the start of this year?
I'd say very mixed. I mean, to really understand, I guess, where I come from, you have to understand who my relatives were. And so when I look out at this crowd, I see my kind of crowd, history buffs and ageless wonders. And we sort of go together. But looking at our history is really something, as a former history teacher, that has to be a living thing that really guides us into the future and reminds us of our past. And so for me, I'm really a mixture of early Minnesota. My family comes from the traders, the early traders. I'm a Faribault on my French side, the early military. I'm an Eastman on my English side, and also on my Scottish side, I'm also military officers, two of them by the name of Jonathan Bean and James McCurdy. And those of you that are history buffs would know something about those names. So my name is Sidney Dixon Bean, named after William Dixon also, and Jonathan Bean. So with that, very mixed feelings, because my people were on the settlers' side, also on the Dakota side that didn't fight in the war, and on the Dakota side that fought in the war. I'm a direct descendant of also Minnie Lightnings, who was a part of the Oyate of Little Crow. Little Crow is buried in my home cemetery at Flanders, South Dakota. So obviously my feelings were very mixed, and I think that's what history is. It's a mix of people. And in terms of our early history, what were the Dakota people like, and what happened with the exile, and what do we do about the exile, and then what about trade and the economics of then and the economics of now? What about the government and the government then, the government now? What about the military and how do we deal with any kind of problems in the past and in the future? So very mixed and yet very hopeful because of all the different kinds of exhibits that took place. I think war is trauma. In order to deal with trauma, you have to understand war, you have to understand what precedes it and what the aftermath can be about. And I think that's what the History Center and those groups that were a part of it have attempted to capture, and I think to some extent we have captured them. But the future is yet for us to capture.
Kurt Braun from the Star Tribune.
I think, Kathy, that we expected at the Star Tribune, we knew this was an important story to tell. But I guess my fear was that the descendants on both the Dakota and the settler side would be interested, but maybe the general public would kind of turn the page. But we got just the opposite reaction. We were really overwhelmed by emails, phone calls, letters. We had a place on our website where you could send in your story, your family story, and there were a bunch of families that did that. So I think even when you look up at the audience today, a sold-out crowd for the annual membership meeting is kind of an unheard of thing. So I think...
It happens every year.
I think the takeaway I get is that there's a great thirst to learn more about this history. It is an awful history, like you pointed out, but I think people really want to know more and want to learn more, and I think that's why we have a big crowd here today, why we were kind of deluged with positive responses to our series in the Star Tribune, and why it's been such a good year, I think, for history.
Representative Erdahl, what were your expectations?
Well, entered the year before, a little bit of trepidation maybe, because I knew that there are, potential conflicts coming ahead. But basically that I expected that people wanted to learn. I was surprised, as Kurt has mentioned, at the numbers of people and the great interest that there was in what happened in Minnesota in 1862. Now, as Sid was, I also am a former history teacher and grew up living in the area where it all started. The first 5 were killed in Acton Township and Acton on August 17th, 1862. My great-great-grandfather, Ole Ness, was there that night and brought them back to Ness Church to bury them with some other folks. So my family and my family history, the area that I live in, is steeped in the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. I didn't quite have the maybe conflicted nature that Sid's family did, in that mine were just Norwegian immigrants. So it was a little more simple, but I like to distill what I was trying to do in helping to create the task force dealing with the Civil War and the U.S.-Dakota War, and talking to the governor about the need for this, is that it was my belief that through education comes understanding, and through understanding can come healing. And I have come to believe that a lot of healing was and still is necessary, that there are still open wounds from 1862. And I would hope that some of the things that have been happening are bringing people closer together.
I want to talk about healing, but I want to go back to Sid Bean here momentarily because you talked about some of the exhibits. There were dozens of commemorative exhibits and events. Which worked well and which did not?
I think the living exhibit, to me, the walk to the border from my home reservation, Flandreau, and having the new director, the new executive director of the History Center there, along with Representative Yurdahl, to meet those of us whose families were exiled, was the greatest exhibit that I could have imagined. And then going together to Pipestone and really reconciling ourselves with the Mother Earth through the pipe. Those kind of living, active exhibits of partnership sort of represent to me what the future has to be about. Learning from the written text, but actually acting on the history, is really how we come together with each other.
Annette Atkins, which exhibits did you see and events that really rang true to you and which just didn't quite get there?
I don't know about didn't quite get there, and I haven't seen all of them, but there was one put together at the Nicollet County Historical Society by Ben Leonard and his crew there, and I think in conjunction with the students at St. Olaf. Or Gustavus right there. And it really did try, like the Historical Society one, to raise issues rather than to give answers. And I think what makes a good exhibit is that issue of raising questions, so that when we leave, we're not settled, but we're unsettled by the history that we've seen.
Representative Yurdahl, what events or exhibits you think really hit the mark and which maybe didn't quite get there?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of county organizations that did some very good things. Nicollet County has been mentioned, Brown County, there's some things in Meeker County, and I know others that I'm not mentioning. So there were a lot of local observances that I think were very important. I did attend some of them. Obviously, I couldn't get to everything. I was at Pipestone for the welcome back of the descendants of the exiles. I thought that was a very meaningful day. That was August 17th. And then 2 days later, August 19th, skipping over my birthday of August 18th, we won't talk about that. But August 19th, we had a ceremony of healing at Nest Church, which to me was very meaningful for a lot of different reasons. One of them being that, of course, it is my home church, the church started by my great-great-grandfather, and where the first 5 who were killed at Acton are buried. And so you bring all of that together with then bringing in about, I think we had 32 Dakota people there, and 1 Ojibwe, and that's another story. But we did have 32 Dakota people there. We had several hundred people in attendance. We could not meet in the church. We had to do it alongside the church in the cemetery, and it was very meaningful to have this ceremony of healing, a wiping of the tears, to have all of these descendants of Norwegian, Swedish, and German immigrants trying to follow the dancing Dakota in a circle. was an interesting sight in itself. But one of the things that we did do, my granddaughter, Violet Yurdahl, named for my mother, Violet, laid the wreath at the gravesite, assisted by Dakota elders. And of course, Violet is the 6th great descendant from Ole Ness. So there was a circle coming together, completing a circle that I thought, again, was a meaningful moment.
One of the events, as it were, or one of the parts of this whole undertaking this year, which I really liked, was Kurt Brown's ebook about Little Crow. I think he did a fantastic job, by the way, and I get to say that to you now here publicly in front of everyone. Were you surprised? You say you were surprised at the outpouring of support and interest. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with just the scope. You know, we took 4 months to research this story, which for a newspaper guy like me is a real luxury, a rare thing. And it took us, we traveled from Crow Creek, where the Dakota, of course, the exiles were sent after the war, and we met with people there. And one day we were, you know, I got my tape recorder out, and a bunch of elders had gathered to talk to us, and we had brought some tobacco as a sign of respect. And the acting chairman of the tribe took a cigarette out and said, "Before you start turning on your tape recorder, do you mind if I say a prayer?" And he took the cigarette and he broke it in half and he said a prayer in Dakota, which he translated into English for me. And he said he was praying and asking his grandfathers to help me tell the story with accuracy and to tell the story truthfully, which I've been a reporter now for 30 years and no one's ever prayed before an interview. On the other side,
Some people prayed after the interview.
500 miles away from the beautiful but sparse and impoverished Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota, we ended up in Grand Marais, Minnesota, on the shores of Lake Superior. We had tracked down through genealogy a guy named Harry Lampson, a retired state trooper, who's the great-grandson of the man who took the first shot in 1863 that ended Little Crow's life. And from up in his perch, it was funny when I told my editor, Kate Perry, who's here today, that we got to go to Grand Marais. And she was like, "Really? It's a long way from the Minnesota River Valley." But anyway, we were talking to Harry Lampson, and he's, like I said, in his 80s now. And he looked back and he said when he was a kid growing up in the 40s, Hutchinson, where Little Crow was shot, would always invite his father, who was a Itasca County deputy, to come and be the grand marshal of their July 4th celebration, because after all, he was the guy who shot Little Crow. And his father would never accept the invitation, but he said that, years later, now you're coming up to talk to me, and all of a sudden, we were heroes back then, and now we're kind of the bad guys. We're the family that ended up with the $500 reward from the state. And so from up in his perch in Grand Marais, he had watched history and his family go from kind of heroic guys who had killed the savage leader of the rebellion, Little Crow, to kind of the bad guys. And he said, now Little Crow's the hero, and you're going to write a big series about him, and we're the bad guys. So it was kind of interesting to get his perspective on how history is really an evolving story. So there's a couple anecdotes from the trail.
You mentioned the prayer, which I think is really moving. Do you think you got it right?
I hope so. It's such a complex
what did you leave out?
story.
What did you have to leave something out? And histories historical facts can be kind of slippery at times.
It was very slippery, and we tried really hard in this series to be balanced and be fair. And in one example I can give of kind of the outtakes, we used a lot of Sam Brown's journal. Sam Brown was a son of a Dakota woman and a white trader and the kind of the Indian agent of the time. So he was taken hostage and was in Little Crow's house, and he would later recall this in his writings and his journals that he kind of culled from his journals. And he recorded both signs of atrocities committed by the Dakota, but also he was a part of the march that just was kind of commemorated, and watched a woman in Henderson come and take a Dakota baby off the breast of her mother and smash the baby in kind of vengeful hatred on the sidewalk. And we had put both those stories in there, but in the balance of this story and trying to get it right, we had so much of the Dakota atrocities and not too much of the white atrocities, so we actually took out some of the Dakota atrocities. So it was a juggling act, a balancing act, to try to be fair to both sides of, like I said, was an awful history, but trying to strike that balance was a challenge, and I hope we pulled it off.
I went to school in the Minneapolis public school system, and I never heard about the U.S. Dakota War in class, and I went to schools that had high populations of Native American students. And I heard many times from NPR listeners after some of the interviews we did about the war along the same line. I grew up in Minnesota, didn't know a thing about this, so the question is, what do we need to teach our kids about the war? How do we need to teach this history? Sid Bean?
Well, as I said earlier, nobody wins at war. War is really a negative. What we need to teach is the positive side of life. And we need to move beyond what I would call confrontational politics and confrontational economics to relational economics and relational politics. We need to teach people how to get along with each other. And we need to teach people that we have a common history. And part of what I was trying to show in my background is that, yeah, I'm so related to so many aspects of history and people that unless I'm seen as a whole person and I'm seen as really related to everybody, I don't exist. So within the Dakota sort of spiritual world, and it's really about spiritual relationships, we say Haumitakiapi before we even talk, which means we are all related. So we need to teach people that we truly are all related and how we're related and how we move from confrontational problem solving to relational understanding.
Professor Adkins?
Yeah, some of the most interesting work that historians have done in the last decade, I think, is about the construction and invention of race. So race not as a biological fact, but race as an ideological construction. And I think, Sid, what you're talking about is ways in which identity got really truncated by the invention of particular racial categories. And so I think part of the reason why people are maybe more open and more interested is we're also in a period where we're paying more attention to the mixture in each person. I mean, it might be Barack Obama. He doesn't like to be called an African-American president or an African-American Democrat or candidate, because he's a mix of people. Or Tiger Woods also has come on some harder times than he once had. But he always reacted and still reacts against being pigeonholed as one person. So if you call me African American, I have to deny my Asian ancestry. If you call me Asian American, I have to deny. So there is an invitation, I think, and an openness for many of us to think more about how mixed we are. The second thing I think I would say about this, that I think one of the things that the war can teach us about is that there are many sides. It's so tempting when we look at wars to talk about both sides and two sides. And if there is a war that rejects that interpretation, again, I think as Sid is talking about his own ancestry, my own scholarly work was on one family, and one of the members of that family was hanged at Mankato in 1862. One of them was fighting in Tennessee on the Union side and came back and joined the Indian side in the war. One was a go-between between Henry Sibley and Little Crow in the war. There were several sisters who tried to vanish into the background so they wouldn't emerge on any side of the issue. So here was one family, and there were 9 children in that family. There were 9 sides that those children took in that war. And I think any close survey of the war takes us to that multiplicity of experience and multiplicity. So then it becomes harder to talk about good guys and bad guys, because everybody's a little bit good and everybody's a little bit bad, and isn't that just like us? Yeah.
Representative Erdahl, as a former history teacher, how do we need to teach this kind of history?
Well, I think the most important thing is to tell the truth, to tell how it happened, why it happened, and acknowledge that there are good and bad things that happened on both sides. It's important that people know. The students today know that our general population understands and knows what happened in 1862. And the thing is that, well, referencing, I believe, David McCulloch on 60 Minutes on Sunday night, saying that we are becoming historically illiterate. And that's a big concern. And the Civil War, you see, was the great overriding moment of American history. I don't believe that the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 even got the notice or acknowledgement that it should have when it was happening. At the very same time that this tragic event is going on in the Minnesota River Valley and in its boundaries, we have Lee moving into Maryland from Northern Virginia, and we have the Battle of Antietam on September 17th. And the national attention was focused on that. And so afterwards, as we go through time, the writings and later on television shows, motion pictures, none of it focuses on what happened in Minnesota, or very little. So history, in some ways, is not completely forgotten, but certainly not given the attention that what happened here deserved. And in some ways, we are paying for that now in the present, because people don't have the knowledge and understanding that they should have, and I think it's still incumbent upon the present and future generations to make sure that that is corrected.
Professor Atkins, want to say something about
Yeah,
that?
I do. I want to take on this issue of truth. Here's one truth. The war started on August 17th, 1862. Here's another truth. The war started in 1492. The war started with the smallpox epidemic of the 1830s. The war that when we start a war and when we end a war, or what decision we make, each of those is a correct answer. I think each of those is a truthful answer. And part of where we come to our differences is where we locate. So does the war end on December 26, 1862, or does it continue into the present? I think any of us who were involved in doing any exhibits or displays or thinking about the war can feel the density of emotion that's still around it. So the ways in which it's not over yet. So we all have to do truth, and we all do truth, and the disagreement is about which truths we pick to tell. I have an exercise that I do with students, have them look around a room, pick out the 5 most important things you see in this room. The only criteria is that they all have to be accurate. So they couldn't say the walls are purple or something, so they all have to be accurate. And so I do that to make this exact point, which is when you look around, even a simple location like this, we would come up with lots of different answers. When you look at something as complicated as Minnesota history, the Dakota War, what you pick out as important can be colossally different one person to the next.
Looks like, Sid, you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say that as a Dakota person whose family was exiled, I don't think you ever forget the war. You know, you're sort of always at war with the trauma of the exile or of genocide or the aftermath of such great destruction. But I think you have to really come to grips with it. I think you have to take it on, as I think this year many people did, from the newspapers to the colleges to the History Center. And myself, I sort of took it on when I returned to Minnesota. I've been involved in a whole variety of projects, bringing Cloudman's Village back, which was the first settlement in the city of Minneapolis, first schools where the Dakota language started. But nobody knows that. Nobody knows that. To bring the legacy of my great-uncle, Alexander Eastman, who Kurt wrote about extensively and used his references in his article, who was the most famous native writer at the time of Mark Twain, and went to Dartmouth, where Louise Erdrich, who just won the National Book Award, is an Ojibwe who was born in North Dakota, came from. That we have to go back and really bring back that history. Even though there was trauma there, we have to bring it back, we have to understand it, we have to teach about it, and then we have to live together in the future in a different way.
Kurt Brown?
Well, 2 things when this whole truth discussion that jump into my mind. One, Abraham Lincoln. The Lincoln movie's about to come out, which is supposed to be tremendous. And I talked to so many people researching this story on the Dakota side who said, here was the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves, but he hanged 38 of my people. But then you talk to others who point out that 303 people, were condemned to death, and Lincoln narrowed that list down to 38. So even a simple thing of Lincoln's role in all this, what do we make of that? And then when you look at Fort Snelling, what do we call Fort Snelling? Was it a concentration camp? Was it an internment camp? Was it a stockade? We drive by there every day, and I know I looked at some of the numbers as the Historical Society, and 850,000 people a year in a 6-month season will visit Fort Snelling. And I just wonder if, instead of interpreting the fort as 1830s and having, tea with Mrs. Snelling or whatever, if we change the interpretation, and I know the Historical Society is moving towards this and broadening the interpretation, but what if we said, let's make it 1862 at Fort Snelling and talk about what would you have done if you were Sibley? Would you have left 2,000 Dakota women and children out on the plain as winter approached? Would you have put them in the stockade to protect them from vengeful citizens? What was the right thing to do, and what should we call it? What is Fort Snelling? What role did it serve in 1862? I think instead of 850,000 people, you'd get more people. And I know that I looked at some of the finances, and Fort Snelling, $1.1 million a year of state and other money comes in, but the revenues are only about $500,000, so there's a $700,000 gap. I think there's so much thirst for this knowledge. If Fort Snelling became kind of the consciousness-raising place where people could learn more about 1862, I bet you'd make more money as a historical society.
I want to take some audience questions here. We have two people with microphones, so why don't you two both kind of come on down, raise your hand, we'll get to you here. Representative Earl, do you want to make any comment on this before we move into the audience? About Fort Snelling, anything else?
Not right now.
All right. I have a question way in the back, yes.
Just quickly, we'll be taking questions from the House, but we are also taking questions from the overflow seating, and we'll read those. So we'll take the questions in the House right now.
Excellent, excellent. We have so many people, we have overflow, which is terrific. Questions from the audience, raise your hand. Go ahead.
My question is this. At that time, Lincoln was fighting the Civil War, and much of his attention was directed away from Minnesota. In looking back, do any of you surmise that if he had more time and attention to devote to who he appointed as the agent, and there was less corruption, would this have been prevented?
Professor Atkins, you and I have talked about this in the past.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been prevented. I don't think it was inevitable that it would turn the way that it ultimately turned. But I think that the corruption in the Indian Agency was so deep-seated and so of such long standing that it couldn't have been eliminated in any easy way. The Indian Bureau would probably have had to be abolished. The one person who I'm kind of interested in this is Lawrence Taliaferro, who was the first Indian agent at Fort Snelling, who predicted that something like this would happen. He said, given the mistreatment, given the misallocation of funds, given the variety of broken promises, something like this is going to happen, because you cannot press people as hard as we are pressing these Native people and not have some reaction to it. So I think it would have taken the abolition of the Indian Agency. And Lincoln had other concerns, and I think the Indians were so low, particularly in 1862, as Dean was suggesting. The North was losing in 1862, and so Lincoln had no energy, attention left over to be dealing with anything that was happening in the Midwest.
Representative Verdal?
Thank you, and I think Professor Atkins is right. I mean, Lincoln was obviously very preoccupied. He did, however, try to keep, some semblance of knowledge about what was happening in Minnesota. And he did bring in people from Minnesota and talk to them at the conclusion of the war. And he made the statement, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't remember the exact words, but something to the effect that if I should survive this war, I want to fix this Indian problem. And he was talking about the government, not the Indians themselves. So, President Lincoln was aware that he had some problems in the system. And obviously he was waiting until the war was over before he chose to deal with it.
We have another question from the audience. Go ahead, sir.
I had a great uncle, Leonidas Merritt, who grew up with the Indians in the Duluth area, at the head of the lakes back then. And he became a blood brother of the Chippewa, or the Ojibwe. But when he was 20 years old in 1864, he decided to join the Army to go in the Civil War. So he walked down the old military road, signed up, and they put him in the Brackett's Battalion. And he spent the next 2.5 years chasing Indians out in Dakota and Montana, and I guess even down to Wyoming. He wrote back near the end to his brother, my grandfather, saying this whole thing is useless. Why did the Army do this? After, I think of what Professor Atkins said about the end, the start and the end, the war was over in early 65, right? And this battalion was out there until 66.
So
Why
you're
was
pres-
that?
Why was that, Professor Atkins?
Well, there are a couple reasons, and I'm sure that several, and Kurt, I think you can talk about this as well. It was out, well, I think it was out there for two reasons. One, ostensibly to protect the people to protect the white people on the frontier from further incursions, as it was talked about sort of at that period. I think it was also to make it look like the government was doing something really significant. The depth of fear and terror among those white settlers who were in that area was so high, I think, that it was really important that the government make a very public, big show of coming to their defense. But boy, that harrying of those Dakota people across the Dakotas is really a harrowing story, and the destruction of their goods and the sort of treatment. So it's a situation in which the public reason and the public presentation is so different from the way in which it was actually carried out. So that many of the soldiers were traumatized, I think, by their experience and by what they were asked to do, every bit as much as any Civil War soldier was traumatized.
Kurt Brown?
I would just add to that we need to remember that the U.S.-Dakota War wasn't this isolated thing that happened in Minnesota. It was the beginning of kind of a wave of this kind of action that would go till the 1880s to Wounded Knee. So when you look at a book like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown, the first chapter is often the U.S.-Dakota War in Minnesota, and then it sweeps across. It was kind of like a tide that was sweeping across the country. So this was just part of an ongoing 30-year war, really.
So another question from the audience. Go ahead.
Well, let me just say, too, that, as Professor Atkins said, Brackett went to near the Canadian border for protection to make sure that there weren't any incursions back into Minnesota. But also there was the feeling of retribution, which was not just in 1862, but also 1863 and beyond, to punish and to find Little Crow at first. And then also from Brackett's command, although they weren't directly associated with it, two men, one of them from Meeker County in my home county, was sent to the north to find Medicine Bottle and Shakopee and basically kidnap them and bring them back to be the 39th and 40th who were hanged.
Thanks, Representative. Another question from the audience. Go ahead, please.
Yes, with regard to Kathy's comment about never having learned about this during the time she was in public school, I was interested because I was in grade school in 58 when the centennial happened, and 62 when we had the centennial of the Dakota-U.S. War, and distinctly remember learning, about the agent who was mean and said, "Let them eat grass," and had his mouth stuffed. And I'm wondering if the knowledge of the McCullough's comment about historical illiteracy, if that cycles around, and do we have to have these events in order to sort of re-educate the population, or are Minnesota kids at least getting an ongoing education in this now?
That's a good question. I'll have my two educators answer, but I want to get Sid Bean in
please.
here first.
Well, I don't know if I got all of the question, but my response is that as an educator, one of the projects I was involved with 3 years before this year and was the Land of the Dakota book, which I was actually the project director of, and that came out of actually 5 years of being on a committee of Upper Bluffs at Fort Snelling, looking at what's going to happen to the Upper Bluffs, which is really about what's going to happen to kind of the economics of that area. And so what it reminded me of is kind of, again, the historical process that we struggle with, that we need to continue to explore and write about and teach about, which is how our economic self-interest has got so out of balance with our American ideal of democracy. And see, to me, that's the basic question and the basic tension between economic self-interest and democratic ideals. Are we going to live together as one, or are we going to fight it and compete against each other for everything? And so I think that's what leads to war. And I think that's what's going to lead to the next war unless we really teach about that tension, come to grips with it, and live together under, the principles of equality and justice.
Professor Atkins.
Yeah, I guess I would approach it slightly differently, though, thinking about how important it is that we define we and our in larger terms than our own families, than our own particular ancestors. So that when we talk about Minnesota, sort of our state, we're talking about a state whose history includes this particular event. So it's not like we had sort of our history and then there's this awful thing that happened. We need to integrate that into our story of ourselves. So who am I as part of a place and as a culture, part of a culture where this thing also happened? And what are the ways in which conflict continues to build? And that's where I think that, Sid, part of what you're talking about is how do we cooperate with each other? How do we alienate each other? And that stories of cooperation and alienation are part of our common story.
Is this what you're talking about here, Annette? And I love Representative Erdahl, too, as a history teacher. The question was also about just teaching it. Is what you're talking about actually taught in classrooms when it comes to U.S. history? Are we missing something here?
Well, I think it is increasingly taught about. The Northern Lights, the new edition of Northern Lights that I know the Education Department is working on right now, has a really wonderful piece, not just on the Dakota War, which is often where then kind of Native people emerge and then sort of go back in, but have introductory chapters on kind of an Ojibwe way of knowing, a traditional Dakota way of knowing, so that these cultures are set up as integral, important, legitimate, serious cultures, and then contrasted and compared with other cultures who come in. So I think that the book is trying to do exactly what we're talking about, which is to make this a collective story, not just a story of either oppressors and oppressed, but a story of living, vibrant cultures changing over time.
Representative Erdahl and then Kurt Brown.
Well, from my experience, I think there's a lot of variety and disparity in how the U.S. Dakota War is taught in our public schools. I mean, for some, their only exposure may be in sixth grade going through Northern Lights, and Northern Lights does a good job of presenting it. I think.
And just for the listening audience for NPR, what is Northern Lights?
It's the textbook that's used in elementary education to teach Minnesota history. And this, I think there could be more to it. The Dakota tribes actually had a meeting with Director Elliott and myself and Governor Dayton, and one of the requests that they had was to do a review of the curriculum and how we are teaching the U.S. Dakota War. And I think that that'd be a good idea. Again, I think that Northern Lights does a good job, but for some, that's all they're going to get. There's no requirement that anything be taught other than in sixth grade.
I would just add, Kathy, that I spent one long afternoon looking at the standards, the education standards. If anyone's ever tried that, there's a matrix on the computer, and it's very confusing. But there is a one-sentence thing that says that every sixth grader in Minnesota is expected to be able to compare and contrast the settler experience and the Dakota experience of the U.S. Dakota War, which made me ask a couple questions. One, is sixth grade the right time for that? It seems kind of young for that. But I do think of all the countless people who told me I never learned any of this in school, most of them were my age, around 50. And just a couple quick anecdotes that shows there's hope. One of my friend's kids who's 13 years old, I told him this project I was working on. He said, I know all about Godfrey. I had to play him. He had a role where they each had one character in this awful history, and he knew all about Godfrey. And then another neighbor came over to borrow our printer one day, and she had done her whole high school junior thesis on Fort Snelling's role in the war. So I think the youngsters are getting it more than we got it.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Say, Sid Bean, what wasn't discussed enough in this past year?
Excuse me? Did you say it again?
Yes, what wasn't discussed enough in this past year for your taste?
I think what's going to happen next year. I guess as a history teacher and as a documentary filmmaker, it's always about the story, and this story always has to be about the next story. So I think we'll look back and say, and really judge this year by what we do next year. And as a Dakota, it's sort of raising up the history and the trauma so we all can understand, you can't point the finger at this was at fault or that was at fault. There's a whole complexity of history and time that we all struggle with and continue to struggle with, that it's really about what we're going to do tomorrow. That's what it's really about.
What do you want to see done tomorrow, the next year, 5 years, 10 years from now?
Well, I'd like to see the continued efforts of building relationships, with our past into the future, the welcoming back of the exile. When I first came back here 9 years ago, I really literally came back from exile, and I had mixed feelings about the History Center. I had even mixed feelings about coming here. I'm here now, because of what I saw happening this last year. So I think the continuation of welcoming the exiles back, because the exiles are coming back, and by coming back, I think we're rebuilding that relationship out of which came Minnesota.
Annette Atkins, what wasn't discussed enough in this past year?
Let me pass for a second. Let me think about that.
Okay, that's fine. Representative Erdahl?
Just pass it to me, huh?
Yep.
You're a legislator. You can talk about anything. Sorry.
I make things up, but well, I think that one of the things that Sid was bringing up. I mean, a lot of people don't understand or don't know about the exiles. I mean, this was a new concept, I think, to many people in the state of Minnesota. They don't know that on March 3rd, 1863, President Lincoln signed the Indian Removal Act, removing all Dakota people, and they threw in the whole chunk just for good measure, beyond the boundaries of any state, meaning they sent them to the Dakota Territory. And I think it's important for people to know and understand about this particular event. Through my legislative career.
And haven't you sponsored a resolution?
Yes, that's what I was going to get to.
Exactly.
Through my legislative career, one of the things that I guess I'm most proud of is that we did pass in the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate, and signed by Governor Pawlenty, a resolution asking Congress to repeal the Indian Removal Act of 1863. Here things get complicated, and it hasn't happened yet. Because apparently we'd also do away with a couple of reservations if they did away with the whole act. But where we are presently is that we are working with Congress to try to simply get a sentence changed or an amendment added that says that the Dakota people are welcome back in Minnesota. Now, obviously, it's symbolic. Dakota people can come to Minnesota anytime they want, and we don't have guards at the border telling them they can't come here. But there is the symbolism that in Washington, in statute, in federal law, it says that Dakota people can't come back to Minnesota.
And with any luck, that will change someday, soon. Kurt Brown, what wasn't discussed enough?
I think, and you could say we're partly to blame for this, but we decided to tell the story of Little Crow, fascinating character, caught up. He grew up 7 miles away from Fort Snelling at the same time at the fort. But I'd say what we didn't pay enough attention to, and we need to pay more attention, is the role of Dakota women. And I think I met a woman on this project named Ramona Keto Stately, who's a Dakota woman educator and a descendant of Dakota who were condemned. And she pointed out it was such a strong matriarchal society. And, we tell the story of Sibley and Little Crow and guys, but the women were the ones who really kept the resiliency of Dakota women to live on the plains out in Crow Creek the years after the war, avoiding starvation and keeping a people living. I think more focus needs to be paid on the Dakota women.
That's what I meant to say. Thanks, Kurt. No, in fact, the thing that I guess I would say at this point is, it seems to me that race is really a hard topic to talk about in Minnesota. And that, I mean, even good-willed, good liberal white people don't know how to talk to Indian people, don't know how to talk to black people. I mean, so what do I say, and what if I make a mistake, and what if I say something racist? I mean, and we need to figure out, and I don't think it's Sid's responsibility to help us figure it out, but we need to figure out how to talk better, more openly about issues of race in this state. I had students who a few years ago, I had a Hmong student in my class, and toward the end of the semester, he came and said, you know what? No one in this class has asked me anything about me. And I talked to some of the other students in the class about this, and they said, you know, well, we didn't want to make him feel awkward or out of place or make him feel different, so we didn't want to pay attention to his difference. Now, he certainly felt his difference. He knew he was different in some ways from those students, so he felt bereft not to be asked. They were trying to be good kids and not notice. He was trying to sort of fit in. So they completely misunderstood each other. I don't know how we get to that place, but if there is a lesson that I certainly need, it's how to do that better.
I have just a few more minutes here, and then we need to wrap it up. So I'm going to start with Representative Urdahl and come down the line here. What happens from here beyond 2012?
Well, hopefully, we keep on remembering what happened and learning into the future. I mean, it's not over. I mean, just historically, in 1863, in Minnesota, 18 were killed. In 1864, 5. In 1865, 7. And so it went into the future in terms of deaths, but also then beyond that, there are all kinds of scars from what happened. And to me, it's still about remembering and healing, trying to do things like change the Indian Removal Act. There are those who think that Chaskey, one of the 38 who was hanged, who really didn't do anything, should be pardoned. So there are these things that will still be moving in the future. Again, we talk about curriculum and how it's taught. That needs to be looked at. I do think that one very positive thing that we haven't mentioned, that what am I doing here? Governor Dayton. I will make no editorial comment on that. But one thing that Governor Dayton did was to repudiate the statement of the proclamation of Governor Ramsey, which he made in September of 1862, that basically called for the extermination or removal of all Dakota people. And so we have to keep moving forward from that.
Kurt Brown.
I would say to keep the conversation going, and I'll bring back the point I made earlier about Fort Snelling. I think, let's broaden it from the celebratory narrative of the 1830s and say what was going on in 1862 at the fort. Let it become a center for people to learn more about what happened. It might not always be pretty, it might be an awful history, but I think there's this great thirst and desire to learn more that we saw from sales of ebooks, we saw from crowds at the History Center exhibit on the war. People want to know more, and we shouldn't wait till the next big anniversary to keep telling the story. We should make Fort Snelling, I would argue, the place to keep the conversation going.
Sid, you touched on some of these things earlier, but final words here from you in terms of what happens from on beyond here.
Well, I think it's continuing the history of the Dakota, because in the past, the history of the Dakota has been seen before 1862, and then with the war, the Dakota were gone here in Minnesota. So I think what this year has done is has reignited the history of the Dakota and Minnesota, and then really it's what that history is going to be about in the future. So for myself, I'm working on a film about my great uncle, Dr. Charles Alexander Eastman, who was born here in Minnesota, was one of the most prolific writers of his day, and was the most renowned Native American of his day. And when I looked at a book recently about the most prominent Native people in Minnesota, he was not in there. So I think we have to go back and say, let's get all of our heroes into the books. Let's bring all of our people together as one, irregardless of what their race is, and then we build a new Minnesota.
Professor Atkins.
And I guess I would hope that next year and the next year, that all of those places that did exhibits on the Dakota War would, for example, do an exhibit on Minnesota textiles, where you have Hmong textiles, Dakota textiles, Ojibwe textiles, Norwegian textiles, Swedish, German, so that we could have a picture also of these very strong things we have in common. Or an exhibit on baskets. You think about how many cultures produce really spectacularly beautiful baskets, or some kind of beadwork, or artwork, or what is it that we all do? And there's so many things that we all do where we won't find quite so much conflict, but we'll find real glories of different cultures. So I want us to layer stories and put other stories on top of other stories till we get a much denser picture of our relationships.
Professor Annette Atkins, Sid Bean, Kurt Brown, Representative Dean Erdahl, thank you for being with us.
And Kathy, thank you.